Have you ever wondered what God's will was for your life and you wanted to say, "God, where's my burning bush? I need a sign"? If so, then this conversation is for you. Today I'm joining Dr. Andy Wakefield, Dean of Campbell University Divinity School, for a conversation about vocation, or God's call. And we're joined by students, alumni, and other members of our community who contributed questions for us to wrestle with. Welcome to Conversations at Campbell, thoughtful explorations of faith and real life. Well, Dr. Wakefield, thank you so much for your willingness to be part of this and to lead in this time of conversation. A moment ago, you spoke about Exodus chapter 3 and the burning bush. And I'm curious, why that story for this moment? What was stirring for you?
It's such a striking image. What could be clearer than a spontaneous combustion that keeps on going and keeps on going? I can imagine Moses. I'm guessing that flocks don't move that quickly, and so he's grazing them for a long time, keeps glancing over. And sooner or later, you got to do something about it. It's such a burning image in our minds that it became a wonderful way to focus that desire for clarity, that desire for direction that we want from God, and then to wrestle with how does God guide us? How do we take those steps of faith? Yeah, absolutely. Well, for those who want to dig into that word further, we'll post that link in the description of the video below. It was a good word, and there's something about us that wants clarity. Amen.
And we don't always have it. In a nutshell, what would you say about the clarity we seek and why that kind of clarity may not always be the best for us?
I think we are still struggling with the very same struggle that we see at the very beginning of the Bible. Adam and Eve are tempted to be like God. To know good and evil for themselves, to know that they have made the right choice. I mean, wouldn't that be nice if you could say with certainty, I made the right choice, so, doesn't matter what you say. That desire to have that kind of certainty, I think, is some of that desire to be God for ourselves, to be able to dispense with the faith relationship that always is calling us to humility, always calling us to relate, to say. Maybe a way of saying it is, if Jesus really is the truth, then we can never have the truth. We can only be in relationship with Jesus. We don't get to have certainty, we get to have Jesus. How about that?
Not a bad trade.
That's
a good thing, yeah. We've worked together for a long time now, and I've always perceived you to be a person who operates out of a very clear sense of call. At the same time, I have a feeling you didn't necessarily grow up as a young child imagining you'd be a New Testament professor and a dean of a divinity school. So along the way, how did you clarify your call? How did you walk that vocational journey?
Well, of course, the easy answer is by faith, one step at a time, often with some uncertainty, with many times when God kindly redirected me, redeemed some choices that I might have made, and used them to further where He wanted me to be. More specifically, again, there have been some times in my life, a time or two, when I had a lot of clarity. It really had to do primarily with the timing of going to seminary. That was one time when it was very clear. But before and after, it really was not. It was walking by faith, and even whenever I had that clarity about going to seminary, I had a friend who helped me introduce some doubts, and I had to struggle with that. I certainly would point to key people along the way. That's, I think, a common theme for many people as they are discerning God's call, discerning God's will. I saw someone that I said, oh, I could see myself being that person or being like that person. That's been true for me at different steps along the way. So certainly as I was exploring the call to teaching, that was an area of gifting. So some of it is, what is the gift? What is the talent? Where do we feel like we have abilities? And I felt that gifting, and I felt like that was certainly God's work. Was that where he wanted me to be? I certainly also enjoy preaching, and is that where he wanted me to be? I wanted to be open to whatever. But seeing someone serving as a seminary professor who was deeply involved in the church, that was pivotal for me. To say, okay, it's not either or, but it's both and, that I can be both exercising this gift of teaching and exercising the gift of ministry. But God wasn't done, so I taught for many years and loved it, still love teaching. It's still the most fulfilling, or at least one of the most fulfilling things that I do. But I came to this place where the divinity school was transitioning. Our founding dean was retiring from being dean. And I began to think about what that would look like. And initially I thought, why would I want to do that to myself? But I began to be aware there were parts of who I am, that I wasn't exercising in my role as a professor. Or at least not as clearly or as distinctly, around leadership and around vision and representation of the school, those kinds of things. And I still did some of that, but as I began to think, okay, there's certainly some things about who I am that God must be having a good laugh to even suggest this to me. There's other parts of who I am that, yes, I could see that would work. But again, people who affirmed key scripture verses along the way. Very powerful to be struggling with something and then encounter a passage of scripture that helps me to say, okay. For me, a key verse was Abram's calling. Abram, before he became Abraham, he is called by God in Genesis 12 to go to a land that I will show you. And that was helpful for me because I didn't know where God was calling me. And I would say now, I still don't know where God is calling me to. He's called me onto a journey. And so to be able to say I'm taking that journey, that's what it is about, rather than I know the destination and I'll get there as quickly as I can.
I think about the stories we hear often about people who have run from their call. When students share testimonies, the book of Jonah comes up a good bit. And I'm reminded that in those stories, it becomes clear that nothing is ever wasted. That some of those twists and turns that seem like a wrong turn end up being fodder for God's good work.
Absolutely. So for me, I, again, had always enjoyed school, enjoyed teaching, very academic in my orientation. So when I was finishing college, I simply assumed that obviously the next step God had for me was to go straight into some sort of graduate theological or graduate education. I was a philosophy major, one of the few, one of the proud. Philosophy majors, and that was a good way to go into unemployment. I assumed if I was going to do graduate work and if I was going to do teaching, well, I must need to apply for a PhD in philosophy. What else would I do? But I could not get any peace. And finally, in feeling like a failure, because I just never got any applications in. And so, well, clearly I had blown it, that I had not gotten the applications in. Feeling like an utter failure, I got a job. That's kind of backwards from what, usually, like my child got a job, we're finally there. But I felt like I surely was on the wrong path. But I had no other option. I had to take a job. I worked, and all that first year that I was working, I felt for sure, okay, I've got to get back on track. I've got to apply. And still, asking God for any kind of, give me just a wisp of smoke, something that would give me some kind of a sign. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Until there was a moment of clarity for me. And it was that I felt very clearly that God had opened up the opportunity for the job that I had. It was something that really sort of fell in my lap. I didn't look for it. Here it was. Who got you this job? Well, God, you got me this job. Why are you trying to leave it? Well, because I simply assumed I knew what I was supposed to do next. But in that moment, it was, okay, this is the place for now. And I was doing computer work. I called myself a computer counselor. I was trying to help computers feel better about themselves. I was working with small businesses, and it was the start of the microcomputer era for small businesses. So doing that, what in the world does that have to do with ministry? Well, it paid my way through graduate school when I did go on to seminary and then to doctoral studies. Occasionally I teach a class in technology and ministry here in the Divinity School. God has not wasted that experience. And in fact, that experience was such a growing time for me. I grew so much in maturity in my faith, had a chance to step into some leadership roles in a singles Bible study group that I was part of, so that when it did become time that God said, okay, now it's time to go to seminary, it was very natural at that point. And again, that was the other really clear moment. So two clear moments. Quit trying to go somewhere I haven't sent you. You're here, be here. And then, now it's time. Those were the two clear moments. Nothing else in 61 and almost 62 years has ever been clear like that. It's always been the step of faith, but I am grateful for those two clear moments.
Beautiful. Nothing's
Mostly
wasted.
clear. I did have a friend who helped me.
Well, in preparation for today's conversation, we invited members of the community to submit questions, and as I looked over the responses, it was so clear that one of the issues that is bubbling for a lot of people would be how best to listen to the voices in their lives, kind of like your friend.
Yep.
There are voices that can be powerfully affirming or even revealing. Somebody can call gifts out of us that we didn't even know we had. And at the same time, those voices that surround us can be painful, even crushing. One member of the community put it this way: what is the best way to defend my calling to those who don't believe that God would call a woman to do what I feel called by God to do? What would you say to that?
First and foremost, we need to recognize the pain in that question. What could be more painful than to feel like you are not worthy, you're not accepted, you're not embraced in what it is that you feel like you're being called to do? So I don't want to move past that without really acknowledging that. And that's going to be true for many of us in many different ways, over many different issues. One of the things that I think would be significant for me, I've mentioned a friend a couple of times that helped me, quote unquote. All he did was ask a question. His question was, Andy, if you're called to go to seminary, to divinity school, what are you going to be? Are you going to be a pastor? Are you going to be a youth minister? And I said, I don't know. And he asked the question, well, if you don't know, are you sure you're called? Okay, there's whatever form it comes in, that's the question. That's the question that hurts. That's the question that makes us lay awake at night. God, okay, I'd had this moment of clarity. It's time to go to seminary, and then, poof. How do I know for sure? Am I sure I'm called? Because I did not have any idea. And part of that was my previous experience. I had stumbled, thinking that I knew where to go, and God had made it clear that wasn't where I was supposed to go, so I didn't want to presuppose that I knew that I was going to be a teacher or a preacher or minister of youth or whatever it might be. So, again, for me, that image of journey instead of destination was enormously helpful. And I think something like that might be very helpful for any of us with whatever issue. Now, there are some matters of theology when it comes to the question about whether a woman is called or not, and we can share experiences of people who have said, what about this Bible verse? What about that Bible verse? I will say that for me, part of it again is digging into the Bible and hearing it for myself, wrestling through it. It turns out that an awful lot of times what people like to talk about as what the Bible says is really what we have heard people say that the Bible says. That's huge. So to really be able to dig deeply and to say, this is my best understanding that just as with signs, I don't think God gives us crystal clarity. You know, we want to pretend as though I just read it, there it is, answer solved, all done. But God gives us the Bible in human language, shaped by and in the context of human experience. Why are we surprised if that means that when we read the Bible, there is the opportunity to wrestle and to ask questions and to be unsure? I thought I had my wife all figured out. I knew exactly what she meant every time she said anything she said. She informed me otherwise. Turns out I don't have her all figured out. Why do I think I've got God all figured out? So simply to say, you know, re-engaging with the Bible, asking the question. I do think if we could maybe move our understanding of call from a static destination to the dynamic journey. And in fact, if we do that, then we really need to be saying, of course I'm called, I'm a Christian. I'm called to follow Jesus. That's, you know, am I called? Yes. Now, where is that journey going to take me? Well, like Abram, when I get there, he may say, although when he said it to Abram, he said, now, Abram, this is the place that your children will come. Now, I want you to go on down to Egypt. So, you know, even then, it's an ongoing journey. It's not static. For me, there became that point of clarity. This is where I need to be here at Campbell as a professor of New Testament, but then something else came along. And is this the place? And big and small, you know, we face those decisions of taking that next step. But if the calling is the journey of following Jesus, then I don't want to say that it doesn't matter. Don't hear me say it doesn't matter whether we get to the right destination. But perhaps instead I should say, God is the one who is working on the destination. My job is to follow him as faithfully as I know how. So one way of saying this is, I don't have to be right. I simply have to follow as responsibly as I know how. That takes a lot of pressure off. Somebody comes and confronts me, I don't think you're called. Well, let me hear you. Maybe I'm missing something. Sometimes, it may turn out that I think I preach like, I don't know who's the famous preacher. Nothing is coming to mind. My mind is completely blank. I preach like Billy Graham. But somebody comes up and says, you preach more like my Aunt Sarah, and that's not a good thing. I need to hear that. I need to get that feedback. If for no other reason, then so I can be open to God working on that. It may not be that the answer is don't preach. It may be the answer is invest in learning more. Invest in sharpening those tools. So we need to hear those voices. But if we could sort of take out of the equation who's right. If we could be willing to say to somebody, hey, you may be right. And that doesn't bother me because I'm on this journey of obedience. And this is my best understanding of where I need to be. And Paul says this to the Philippians. If we're both wrong, God will show us. Wow, that takes a lot of pressure off. I don't have to be right. I just have to be following as best I can, knowing that God is going to redirect me. He'll do it. And it may be through that voice. Maybe I hear that and that changes my path. But I hope that that's helpful for folks.
Yeah. Well, Campbell Divinity School is an institution that strongly supports women in ministry. And I know that a lot of those questions that come up, a lot of the debate is around New Testament text, and you happen to be a New Testament professor. And there are a lot of things that have been written about all of this, but I wonder if you could put in a nutshell what your answer would be biblically about why you would affirm women in ministry.
That's a great question. And I'll have to give you the short version, but come back for the long version if you want to. The short version is that a lot of the verses that are used to say women can't be fill in the blank. Preachers, pastors, senior pastor, maybe you can do this, but can't do that. A lot of those verses, there's something sort of a double angle that's going on here, where on the one hand, those verses are emerging from a context, a social context, in which very clearly women were in a secondary status, men had the authority, all those things. So, that's the social context out of which it comes. But we are reading it from a context where we are sort of sometimes assuming that as we read it, even though we might be in a different context. So there's sort of this double twist that's going on in our reading of these passages. As I have wrestled, and I think that's the way I would want to say it, as I have wrestled with these passages, seeking, again, I may be wrong. If I am, God will show me, but seeking to understand. I have been astonished when I really began to pay attention. Astonished not at how, for example, Paul is often seen as sort of the chief put-downer of women. That is a word, right? Put-downer?
Sure.
Put her down, whatever it is. But I have been astonished when I really pay attention, think about Paul's context. I've been astonished at how radical Paul is. He's actually radical in his call for men and women together. So let's take an example, Ephesians chapter 5. Oh, yeah, we know what that says. Women should be submissive to their husbands. There's some textual and exegetical issues that we could get into, but let me skip to the real meat here. When we read that, here's this double angle going on. In our context, it sounds like Paul is being countercultural. Oh, okay. Paul is calling us to be different than the people around us. We need to have this biblical hierarchy in our marriages. No. In Paul's context, he just said, rain is wet. He said something so obvious that nobody blinked. Of course, women should be submissive. What are you talking about? That's like saying rain is wet. Yes, women should be submissive. Who knows anything different? But he doesn't stop there. And this is crucial. He doesn't stop there. He says, now let's talk about husbands. Let's talk about how husbands need to be sacrificing themselves and giving themselves for their wives. Kind of like Jesus gave himself for the church. I half-jokingly say, that my wife says that she will submit to me as soon as I go to the cross for her. Okay, where is the burden in this passage? Where is Paul really doing something that lays a burden? He's not laying any burden on women in his culture. That's already there. He's laying an enormous burden on the men, a radical, unbelievable demand that they would consider their wives to be their own flesh and that they would nurture and care for her, and all these things that just are not part of the vocabulary. So that to me is where I began to say, okay, now Paul's actually stirring up trouble, but he's not stirring up the trouble I thought he was. He's a pretty radical feminist. Long before that became a thing. That's where I am. And again, maybe I'm wrong, but that's where I have come in my reading. And we could do similar kinds of things with other key passages where pay attention. Don't just read the one verse, let the women keep silent in church. That's the only verse there. That's the only verse in 1 Timothy, right? Nothing else. No, actually there's more there. You read the rest and you pay attention and you begin to say, okay, actually, this verse doesn't say what I think it said or what somebody told me it said. That's more often the case.
Yeah. I want to circle back around to something you said a moment ago when it comes to discerning the call, because we are not only people that are responding to our call, but if we're living into our call, we're also helping to call out the called. We're helping other people hear their call as well. And it seems to me if it's going to be discernment, it can't only be affirmation. If discernment is discernment, we're really testing a thing, we probably need to help people struggle through to see what's authentic and what's true, what God is up to, what God is saying. Here's how someone in our community put it. It was a really intriguing question. To what degree is it fitting? By the way, I like that kind of hedging here. To what degree? It may be some, maybe not. To what degree is it fitting for a Christian leader, mentor, friend, fellow disciple, church, to question or even resist someone else's particular sense of calling? In an effort to be nice, loving, affirming of someone's desire to follow God, are we perhaps reluctant to provide pushback to someone who may seem sincere but misguided in their sense of call? Is there any room, in other words, to ask the hard question, to maybe have a person dig a little deeper to test their call?
One of the famous discussions of calling comes from Reinhold Niebuhr, who talks about call that is at different levels. There's the call that all Christians have. There's the call that is that inner voice within us. But he describes also an ecclesial call, meaning that it's one thing for us to say, I'm called, but it's also up to the church to say, yes, you are, and we want to bring you in as a leader in that way. So I definitely think that there is an important role for the voices of others, which sometimes come as the unwelcome question, which sometimes come as the discouragement that maybe We have to wade through to get to a stronger place. I would say you've turned the question around in an interesting way. What about what should I do when I'm talking with someone and I'm not discerning the same calling that person has? One of the things that I think, first of all, let me acknowledge, not easy to say to somebody, yeah, have you considered an ice cream truck? Maybe that's, more. I want to be encouraging. I also want to recognize that I'm not God and I don't know. And I'm not the final voice. But I can, I think, authentically say something like this. Tell me more about that. I wouldn't have thought that. I wouldn't have seen that. Tell me more about that. I'm saying this and I'm thinking to myself, how would that go if I said it? I'm not sure how well that would work. Asking questions. Yes, questions can be terribly uncomfortable and even crushing, but asking questions that are generous and affirming and loving, but still asking questions, can be a way to help people to think through things that they may not have thought about. So here's an example, and it may not be a good example, but talk to me about this call that you have to music ministry. Do you feel like you're going to have some areas where you're going to struggle with that? Where do you see some areas that God is going to need to work on you for that? Again, I'm saying this and I'm thinking to myself, how would that go? And it probably would depend on the person I'm talking to and how they're responding and trying to help them. But rather than planting the question, are you sure you're not called to an ice cream truck? Instead, planting the question, what is it that needs to happen in order for you to live out this calling most effectively, most authentically? That's a pretty good question, especially for somebody who's in theological education who would want to say, hey, you might want to consider opening yourself up to the growth process, the transforming process, the nurturing process, formation process that happens in graduate theological education. You will open yourself to God pushing you and probing you, and it won't always be fun, but it will be powerful. That you will emerge with a much clearer sense about how God is at work and where you still have growing to do and where God is leading you for now. And you'll still come out with lots of questions about, not sure what God's up to, but I'm following as faithfully as I know how.
Given that none of us are omniscient, it probably helps to ask humble questions instead of trying to speak for God and shoot down a call. But I think that's a really good word.
Let me just re-emphasize that. I think one of the more damaging things that we do to each other is to make pronouncements. Or to ask questions that really are pronouncements. Instead of genuinely inviting dialogue.
Yeah.
So that,
yeah,
I think
that's right.
Key.
Okay, you ready for lightning round?
All right,
okay.
Let's do it.
3 very quick but related questions. Here we go. Can your calling change over time?
Yes.
Can you have more than one calling?
Yes.
Is calling somehow rooted in a specific skill set, or is it something broader?
Yes.
Okay.
And
well, I'm glad we settled that.
Yes and no.
Okay.
To all of those. Can your calling change over time? Well, not at its root. At its root, your calling is to follow Jesus. So that's not changing. You're called to follow. The direction that takes you, oh yes, absolutely. That can change. Again, A lot of times in church, or at least in my experience of church growing up, we talked about things so statically. You know, you're going to be called to this. There it is, right there. Destination, static, set in stone. You either got it right or you got it wrong. Got it wrong, I'm sorry, you're gone. I don't want to overdo this, but at the risk of being overly provocative, let me say that sometimes in church, we operate as though God is dead. He gave us some instructions long ago, and then he died. Or maybe he just went to sleep. I don't know which. But we've got to figure out what he said. What would Jesus do if only he were still alive? As opposed to, what is Jesus doing because he is alive? What is God saying because he is the living God who breathes life into his word and into his people? To operate with the conviction that God is alive is to commit yourself to a dynamic journey rather than a static. God is at work and he's going to keep on leading me. And that may change, go in a different direction than I was before. It may be that I am called to do this and this. For me, I mean, I don't. To me, it's one calling, but you know, I serve churches as an interim pastor. I love doing that. Love the preaching and love the engagement with people in the church. And I teach. And I also administer. I guess I've got 3 callings. But they're all one because they're all where Jesus is taking me at this point. Is there a particular skill set? Yes. Surely the skills and gifting that God has given us becomes an obvious vehicle for God to work, becomes an obvious tool for God to use. At the same time, I think, I don't want to universalize this, but I will say from my experience, it's definitely the case that God has called me to some things that go beyond my natural skill set. So I'm an administrator. I serve as a dean. That means I get to make decisions. My personality type, if you do the Myers-Briggs, I am not someone who likes to make decisions. I like to keep the options open. And maybe we ought to think about that a little bit longer. But very often, I need to go ahead and make the decision. And so I do that. And it's consciously stepping beyond my natural skill set. Because I do feel that that's where God has called me for now. Hopefully I do it well, and hopefully I do it effectively, but that's a growing journey. You know, God continues to refine. So, yeah. Yes and no.
If calling is ultimately about following Jesus, then that means that calling is not just occupational either. So it's not just about what we're doing even in church work, but it's also about my call to be a good dad, a good husband, a good son to my parents, a good brother. There's more dimensions than just our occupation.
So you asked me a question earlier about, you know, out of my expertise, whatever expertise I have as a New Testament scholar, we like to talk about the Great Commission. At the end of his life, or the end of his time on earth, still alive, Jesus commissioned the disciples. Go ye therefore into all the world. I mean, I've heard this a million times because I grew up as a missionary kid. So, you know, Great Commission. Well, you go back and actually read it. And this is a place where having access to the tools that let you dig into the original language to see what the Greek says can be very, very helpful. So it turns out that the verse doesn't say, go ye therefore. It says, having gone. it assumes we're going. You go places, don't you? I go places. We all go places. Having gone, do something. There's something to be done there as we go. So it's not as I go to work and it's everywhere I go. And what is it I'm called to do? So here's another place. The Greek is an interesting word here. It's a word that is based on the noun disciple, and it's made into a verb. So the closest I could get to it in English would be having gone, discipleize. Yeah, not really an English word, but my best effort to do it. That word it does include leading people into discipleship, but if you look at where that word is used elsewhere, its primary, or at least its first meaning, is to be a disciple. As you go, discipleize. Now, isn't that the calling for everybody who's called by God? We're called to be disciples wherever we go. If we do that, that's going to create opportunities for leading people into discipleship, leading people and teaching them and all those things. So, yes, it is not, following the call is, I'm afraid, all-inclusive. It includes everything we do.
So let me ask you a final practical rapid-fire question. Top 3 things you would say somebody should do to practically explore or clarify their call if they're feeling that they need to refine their call, or maybe they're in a time of pivoting and discerning.
So based on what I just said about, the call starts with and ends with, in a way, the call to be a disciple, to practice our discipleship. That's the starting place, isn't it, for us? And I think so often we hear that from our students, that their call to ministry emerged out of their call to go deeper in their relationship with God. They felt like, there's more that God is doing, there's more that God has for me. I need to do some more study. I need to spend time in the Bible. I need to spend time in prayer. And so, number one, be a disciple. Spend that time in discipleship. Number two, practice that attitude of openness. At least for me, and that may be true different for others, but as we're in that period of discernment, we feel like God is doing something. Dr. Cogdell, Mike Cogdell, the founding dean, would say, God is meddling with our lives. And we feel that. We feel that disequilibrium. Something, we're not at the place we need to rest for a while. There's something going on here. And so that's a time of openness. And that's certainly how I have sometimes learned to do. Sometimes I try to rush God straight into a decision, but with a little age and wisdom and experience, trying to accept that moment or that period of disequilibrium as, okay, God, I want to be open. Where are you taking me? What is ahead? Is there something different? And so being open to hear the voices of different people, not to take them for the gospel, but to hear them. Being open to see the opportunities that are out there. Sometimes God begins to do this disturbing work in our life, and then later the opportunity emerges, and it's sort of the aha moment. There it is. Frederick Buechner says that call is the place where our passion meets the world's needs. I paraphrase that, but I feel this sense of movement and the sense of passion, and then suddenly the opportunity is there, and have that moment to respond. You asked me for 3, didn't you? Let's see. Number 3, come to divinity school. That's number 3.
Well, Dr. Wakefield, it has been a joy to talk with you about calling. Friends, would you express your appreciation to Dr. Wakefield?
Thanks for listening in to Conversations at Campbell. Why don't you join the conversation? Subscribe to the channel to be notified of future episodes, or better yet, join us on campus for the next event. We'll even buy you lunch. Check out the video description for links to the upcoming conversations and additional resources related to today's discussion, like readings, study guides, and other great content. Until next time.